Hey internets, so there's a very cowardly strategy out there that's very common that can be used for political, ideological, or even just basic personal gain, and it's a very nefarious and very effective strategy, and yet interestingly enough, it currently doesn't really have a good term to describe it yet. There's a few related terms, but none of them really nail it down. So in this video, I'm going to be explaining what this strategy is, and coining a term that allows us to better call it out when we see it. And that term is what I now like to call conflict grifting, which is where a person or a group of people attempt to cause a conflict, but in a strategically sly way as to make it seem like somebody else has caused the conflict. And as a result of this, an aggressor is able to pretend like they are the victim. And so thus the strategy is to gain the benefits that come with being the victim, such as being viewed as legally and morally in the right, despite the fact that they intended for the victimization to occur. Now, another way to understand conflict grifting is to look at similar concepts. There are terms out there such as crybullying, which is where a person just generally feigns victimhood while in fact harassing others. However, crybullying is a little bit more broad in this sense. Crybullying can also simply refer to just lying about what happened. For example, a crybully might engage in conflict grifting, but in other cases a crybully might simply falsely report or falsely accuse somebody, or just generally make stuff up in order to get other people on their side in order to gang up on their target. Or another similar term would be wound collecting, which is where a person tries to create a list of all these various grievances of the past and kind of dredge them up in order to justify aggressive actions in the present. Or perhaps probably the closest term I've seen is that of mid-level violence, which is more or less strategic provocation, and seems to be a term coined by James Lindsay in order to explain that kind of strategy where, as he says, agitators will engage in behavior that, if accepted, moves one of their mass line agendas along, or that, if resisted, provokes a reaction that can be framed as an unjust overreaction. Which, in the context of protests, this definition might be close enough, but it really only scratches the surface on a philosophical level of what's really going on here. Because from a strict moral sense, in terms of philosophy and ethics, part of the entire point of ethics is to look at what is and what is not justice. And one way to look at this is through the libertarian concept of the non-aggression principle, which doesn't necessarily mean being against violence, but means being against aggression, which can be loosely understood as simply the act of causing conflicts. Which now, in some cases, it's very easy to understand and identify who has caused the conflict, such as, for example, in the case of armed robbery. It's very obvious that the man pointing the gun at the other guy and saying, "Give me all your money," is the one that is causing the conflict and is thus very much in the wrong. However, sometimes it's not always easy to spot, and that is where the strategy of conflict grifting comes into play. The conflict grifter will try to cause a conflict, but in a way that makes it look like, to an outside observer who is not fully aware of all the context, that it is their victim who is the actual aggressor. And so here's a simple example of how this might play out. Imagine someone trespasses on another man's land and just kind of sits there cross-legged with a smug smile on their face, pretending to meditate. This pose, of course, makes them look very peaceful, but in fact they are trespassing. And so let's say the guy who owns this home comes up and asks him to leave, and he just continues to sit there in his pose and smile smugly, and just completely ignores the owner of the property. And so the only way to get rid of him is for the property owner to effectively physically force him off the property. And let's just say that this trespasser has a camera set up somewhere that is recording the whole thing, and so then he later clips the part where the owner is forcing him off the property, and then later posts the video and accuses him of overreacting, and of course claims to be the victim in the ordeal. And so that is the basic act of conflict grifting. People who are unaware of the context, or unaware of the fact that he's trespassing, in this specific example, they will end up believing that the wrong party is the aggressor. And that is the essence of the conflict grifting strategy. It is a way to aggress on a target while also confusing others about who is the actual aggressor. And thus the conflict grifter walks away with both the benefits of aggression and the benefits of the victim. This all may seem simple enough, but it's not always that easy. And so let's look at a more complex, recent example to see just how easy it is for people to fall for this. This is why I feel pretty good to be sponsored with Ground News for this video. Rather than just being another boring news source, Ground News compiles thousands of articles into an easy-to-read format that just gives you the straight facts about a story, as well as showing how journalists from opposing sides of the political spectrum are reporting on stories completely differently. This lets you see through media bias in a way that mainly just saves you a lot of time. It's why I often use Ground News to help with the research behind a lot of my videos, such as, for example, the video you're watching right now. The corporate media went absolutely insane over Padilla getting kicked out of this press conference and arrested. If we look at Ground News' bias distribution chart, you can see just how many different publications had something to say here. And yes, you can click on any one of these publication icons to be taken directly to their version of the story. Or you could even just look at the base stats for this story. Over 850. Reading all of that would take you weeks. And so hot button stories like this are where Ground AI summaries really come in handy. And what's particularly useful here is they give different versions of the summaries for right, left, and center bias. And so you can easily spot key differences. Like in this this particular article, one thing that stands out is that right-leaning media claims that Padilla did not identify himself before charging the podium, while left-leaning sources claim that he did. As for who's telling the truth here, it's actually a bit complex, and I'll be getting more into things during the main part of this video, but spoiler alert, in this case the right is a little bit closer to the truth. But anyways, as far as ground news goes, this gives you a fairly good idea of said narrative differences and general bias. Ground news just in general does a good job helping you find stories as well, because not all events are as heavily reported as this one. You often have stories that are either being over or underreported by different political factions and ideological narratives, and so that's where their blind spot feature comes into play, letting you see who is hiding what, or on the flip side, who is trying to make a big deal out of some nothing burger. But most importantly, ground news continues to remain independent and subscriber funded, so to gain access to these features, go to ground.news/Mentiswave or scan my QR code here to get 40% off the Vantage plan, which will grant you unlimited access. But anyways, let's go a bit more in depth into what Alex Padilla actually did and what actually happened, because there's a few people out there who've also correctly identified that he was most likely staging the whole thing, but no one's really called it out as well as when you understand it using the term conflict grifting. But let's start from the top with just a quick rundown. This whole thing started within the context of these recent Los Angeles riots that have been happening within the last month, specifically in regards to ICE and immigration enforcement. Basically, people were protesting against the act of illegal immigrants being deported, and the whole thing got a little heated with the National Guard being called in, and Trump and Gavin Newsom arguing over who controls said National Guard. But the TLDR is that there was a protest in Los Angeles against immigration enforcement that, got a little bit out of hand. And so this then leads to Kristi Noem showing up and giving a sort of pro-ICE immigration enforcement speech. The whole rah, 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 we're not leaving, we're going to continue enforcing immigration laws, the DHS is doing a good job, etc., etc. Kind of the typical rallying the troops sort of speech. Very typical, run off the mill, nothing about it is really special. What made things stand out is that Alex Padilla, one of the senators for California, decided to kind of just crash into this speech that Kristi was giving and charge the podium like a rhino, just completely unannounced, while demanding his questions be answered. The whole thing was just kind of a circus show, and honestly, no amount of words I can say can really give it justice, so I'm just gonna roll a couple clips of it happening.
Country and what they have tried to insert into this city. So I want to say thank you to every single person that has been able to do this. Also, I want to talk
Senator Alex Padilla, I have questions for the secretary, because the fact of the matter is a half a dozen violent criminals that you're rotating on your head.
Now, from these clips, a few narratives immediately kind of just automatically get debunked. One of them is the claim that he identified himself, which he kind of did, but that's really just pedantically correct. When someone's giving a speech on a podium, especially a major political figure, you have to provide identification, specifically proof of identification, before you actually go up there. It's one of those things where you have to set things up and verify everything ahead of time for the sake of just basic security. You can't just charge the podium like a rhino, and then once you're getting pushed back by security, then identify yourself just verbally. That obviously just doesn't count. And of course, he also might have noticed that what he was doing wasn't just simply peacefully asking a question, but rather he was directly heckling her as well as interrupting her mid-speech. Just completely talking over her without waiting his turn at all. This kind of behavior will pretty much get you thrown out of any conference regardless of who you are. And again, Alex Padilla should know this. He is well versed enough on how these conferences work to know full well that the way he was behaving would get him thrown out. And this is kind of where we see the first piece of basic evidence that Alex Padilla was engaging in a conflict grift here, because Alex Padilla knows this about speeches. As the United States Senator, there's no way you can get this high up on the totem pole without understanding that there is a process behind these things. He knows darn well that the rules are you can't just charge at a podium and then state your business after the fact. And from the perspective of security, that kind of makes sense. Any major private speech usually follows similar rules. It doesn't really matter who you are, you can't just randomly try to interrupt someone's speech and demand that they give you attention, and then refuse to leave when security tries to get you to back off. If that wasn't the case, then these kinds of speeches you wouldn't be able to even do them, because if you just allowed anybody to interrupt them like that, then they would just never finish. And so that's why they usually have questions and answers sessions and specific segments that allow these kinds of conversations to take place. And Alex Padilla, again, being a United States Senator from California, has plenty of connections where he could set up that kind of dialogue with Kristi Noem if he wanted to. And this kind of problem just wouldn't have ever occurred. In other words, there's no no way that Alex Padilla could not have known that what he did and how he did it would have ended up provoking the response from security that happened. Pretty much anybody who behaves this way in any kind of major speech is going to get tackled by security. So it makes no sense for Padilla to do this, again, especially when you consider the fact that he had plenty of other avenues by which he could talk to Christie, unless he wanted that to happen. And there's also various other hints that the whole thing is just kind of fake. For example, just looking at the clip and watching his behavior, if you have knowledge of acting, it's pretty obvious that he's just putting on a show. There's very little emotion behind what he's saying. The words spewing out of his mouth are very clearly scripted, especially when you examine what he said as he was being dragged out. It was just, I am this guy and I have questions for the secretary. It was the exact words needed in order to make the other side look bad. And of course, it was stated in the most robotic, non-emotional way you could possibly imagine. But what also stands out about it is how the people trying to argue that what he was doing wasn't a conflict grift, well, they have to resort to really weird, bizarre arguments. Like, for example, the whole lèse majesté argument. Oh, he's the senator, so he should be allowed to break the normal rules of a conference. Well, no, you can't actually do that. Because again, remember, he didn't actually provide his identification. Some of the people there may have recognized who he was, but that doesn't matter. Because security doesn't really know if a person really is who they claim to be, or if they're just a person who's a lookalike. That was, planning to do something a little bit more nefarious. And of course, you can't just interrupt people mid-speech and talk over them out of line. That rule reigns true regardless of whether or not you're a senator. What he did was rude and disrespectful regardless of his position. Rude is rude regardless of who you are. It's honestly one of the craziest arguments I've seen from the Dems in quite a while, this kind of weird idea that being a senator is a free pass to be an ass. No, it's, kind of not. That's kind of an insane argument to make. And that's just a basic reason why you have to set these things up before time. Again, you can't just bum rush a podium. Padilla knows this. And so there's this kind of idea that, oh, well, he's the senator and everyone should know that, and so he should just be an exception to the rules, an exception to security, blah, blah, blah. And that's completely ridiculous. No, he shouldn't be an exception to the rules. Why would anybody be an exception to that rule? The only exception I can really think of is when the owner of the building where the speech is taking place wants the speech to come to an end. But again, even in that instance, he would still be identified beforehand. And so thus the most logical explanation is that Padilla knew exactly what he was doing. He did it specifically to provoke that response. He did it because he wanted to get dragged out of there. So the whole thing was just an optics game, which is really kind of the heart of what a conflict grift really is. It's not really meant to trick the person who is being falsely accused of being the aggressor, because they obviously know what's true. Rather, it's meant to put on a show for the outside audience. And we can see that when we look at some members of that audience who, aren't really quite the brightest, like Hassanabi, for example. I'll just roll this little clip right here.
If this is how the Department of Homeland Security responds to a senator with a question, you can only imagine what they're doing to farm workers, to cooks, to day laborers out in the Los Angeles community and throughout California and throughout the country. We will hold this administration accountable.
I mean, Alex Padilla is right. If they do this to a senator for asking a question, what are they doing to everybody else? What are they doing to average citizens who don't have this protection?
Yeah, notice how Hassanabi gave absolutely no real analysis of the event whatsoever. He just kind of accepted it at face value. And that's kind of how the conflict grift works. They don't really want people to question it, because it's of course the examination that reveals it to be a grift. It reveals it to not actually be what it appears to be. Reveals it that the person who's pretending to be the victim is in fact the aggressor. And of course, the one and only argument that Hassanabi gave was, hilariously enough, an argument that has been mirrored by many other Democrat politicians. The whole lèse majesté argument. Oh, he's a senator, so they can't treat him like this. If they treat a senator like this, then imagine how they would treat anybody else. Well, they would treat anybody else pretty much the same. Again, if you try to bum rush a podium during a speech by a major public figure, you'll generally get stopped by security. And honestly, it's kind of funny to see a bread tuber mirror this argument. I mean, it's not surprising. It's pretty obvious when you're aware of what bread tube arguments are that they're just the men who agree with the establishment while pretending to be anti-establishment. So again, it's not really surprising surprising to see Hasanabi doubling down on the he's a senator so he should get special treatment against the rules argument, but you do have to admit it's pretty hilarious to see. Hasanabi, socialist friend of the people, watch him as he bravely complains about politicians not getting special treatment. Yeah, man, that's how you crush the establishment. We're gonna crush the establishment by complaining and whining and crying when you see a major figure of the establishment not being allowed to circumvent basic social rules. It's kind of insane, really, but again, that is the strategy of the conflict grift. It works so long as people don't really think about it, but the more you look into things, the more obvious it becomes. Especially when we look at the aftermath with Padilla and the speech he gave immediately after this incident. So I'll just roll another quick clip.
I'm here in Los Angeles today, and I was here in the federal building, in the conference room, awaiting a scheduled briefing from federal officials as part of my responsibility as a senator to provide oversight and accountability. While I was waiting for the briefing with General Guillot, I learned that Secretary Nome was having a press conference a couple of doors down the hall. Since the beginning of the year, but especially over the course of recent weeks, several of my colleagues, have been asking the Department of Homeland Security for more information and more answers on their increasingly extreme immigration enforcement actions. And we've gotten little to no information in response to our inquiries. And so I came to the press conference to hear what she had to say, to see if I could learn any new additional information. And at one point, I had a question. And let me emphasize, just as we've emphasized the right for people to peacefully protest and to stand up for their First Amendment rights, for our fundamental rights. I was there peacefully. At one point, I had a question. And so I began to ask a question. I was almost immediately forcibly removed from the room. I was forced to the ground, and I was handcuffed.
Yeah, so I'll just put it this way. If I was Alex Padilla and I wanted to pull a conflict grift off, that is exactly the crap that I would say. If you examine everything he just said, you'll realize how carefully crafted the narrative is. First off, he went on about what he was doing originally in that federal building with his conference, but that's totally irrelevant to the speech that Kristi Noem was making. And so why would he mention it? Well, he mentioned it to make it seem like he was just there innocuously and just simply doing his job. It's a sleight of hand distraction to try and conflate what he was doing and what Kristi Noem's speech was, and to try and trick people into considering them within the same context, even though it's totally irrelevant. Basic gaslighting technique. Next, what he said was basically just towing the party line along with the Democrats' current position is on basic immigration enforcement. Again, totally irrelevant to what he did. Instead, he tries to deliberately circumvent the context, claiming he was there peacefully, claiming he just had a question. And so he's just completely ignoring the reality of his belligerence and how he went about asking that question. There's a right way to do it, giving your identity beforehand, waiting your turn, and then there's a wrong way to do it, which is rushing to the front of the line and demanding your question be heard, and then fighting against security officers when they try to push you back. Padilla just conveniently leaves that all out, and that's how you know that this is a conflict grift. Because again, conflict grifts work upon third-party ignorance. They prey on people who are not aware of said context. And so the fact that he's deliberately ignoring it and leaving it out in his speech proves that he knows exactly what he was doing, which of course was then further confirmed in a later event where Padilla complained about it on the Senate floor, where he, again, just completely ignored the context. He just totally left out the fact that he was rudely interrupting Kristi during mid-speech, which wouldn't be considered acceptable behavior no matter who did it. And then, of course, he breaks down in crocodile tears. Again, totally ignoring context. Very obvious that this is exactly what he wanted to happen. And on a more serious note, this is something that especially libertarians need to grasp, because we're the ones that are usually talking about the non-aggression principle all the time. And so it's really important for us to properly understand what does and what doesn't violate the NAP. Because a conflict grift, the entire point of it is to try and take advantage of that concept and trick people into viewing the aggressor as the victim. Especially in cases like this, because I know that there's a lot of open borders libertarians out there, which I'm not one of, but I know there's quite a few out there who might be inclined to agree with Alex Padilla on at least his basic level in terms of his politics in this specific situation. Because ultimately what this all comes down to is it's all about illegal immigration and whether or not the border should be enforced or not. And as a result of this, I've seen even a few of those open borders, sort of left Rothbardian types actually falling for Alex Padilla's nonsense here. And it's really important not to fall for crap like this, because when you examine it and just think about it for more than a couple minutes, it's very obvious that what happened is exactly what Padilla wanted to happen. He barged to the front and started rudely interrupting Christie in the middle of her speech, shouting over her, with the very obvious intent to provoke that kind of response. And everything that transpired after was just obvious, again, crocodile tears. He was just doubling down on the conflict grift, along with similar grifters like, of course, Elizabeth Warren and Chuck Schumer, who of course also attempted to capitalize on this grift for the same reasons. Because at the end of the day, it's all just about political and ideological and social gain. It is ultimately an optics ploy. It's a way to paint the people you disagree with as evil for reasons that aren't actually true. And besides Padilla, there's other edge cases we can look at that really makes us understand why it's important to be able to recognize what is and what is not a conflict grift. Because the thing is, even people who aren't libertarians, one thing I've noticed, one kind of white pill honestly about the situation is that most people on a intrinsic level agree with the NAP. At least in the sense that most people agree that in conflicts, the people who cause the conflicts, the people who are responsible for the problem, are generally the people who should be considered in the wrong. And so there's a base recognition that most crimes are avoidable if people behave rationally and ethically. And thus most problems, most conflicts of resources or conflicts just in general day-to-day life and interaction, those conflicts are coming from intent. They are conflicts that could have been avoided had one party decided to not be a total dick smurf that day. And so that's why conflict grifting works, despite the fact that most people don't necessarily identify as libertarians. The thing is, most people, even though they don't identify that way, most people agree on a basic level at least with the NAP. But that's also where this perverse incentive comes in to cause a conflict while pretending like you're not the person causing the conflict. And it can be used to many ends. For example, another case of conflict grifting that you might see is in things like traffic obstruction protests. It doesn't really take a genius to figure out that when people obstruct traffic, they're the ones that are causing the conflict. In fact, one relatively simple, straightforward point I've seen in regards to this is that those who are obstructing traffic for some kind of protest, like for example climate activists, they particularly love to do this because they're protesting against global warming, so of course they obstruct traffic because cars equal oil equal bad, blah blah blah. And one very simple counterpoint to this is that what they're doing is effectively kidnapping. People who find themselves in their car stuck on the road in this kind of situation, well, their ability to leave is impeded by that kind of action. I mean, there's miles of cars behind them and miles of cars in front of them and nobody's moving, so they're just stuck there. Which then just brings up the question, what if someone is on their way to the hospital for a serious illness? Because, you know, not everybody calls for an ambulance for something like this, and even in that case, an ambulance would still end up getting stuck in that traffic as well, so it doesn't even matter. So what if somebody in that massive traffic stop, what if they're dying? And well, the answer is, as a result of that traffic obstruction protest, those people are just pretty much screwed. And that's just the extreme example. There's also other slightly less obvious second order effects. Like, for example, what if a poor person who doesn't have the money to afford rent that month is going to a job interview so that they can afford rent, so that they're doing the right thing, trying to find a job so they can actually get money to pay their rent? You know, relatively common working class problem. And if they get stuck by that traffic obstruction protest, well, now you've placed them in a situation where because you force them to be stuck in that traffic, now that person can very well end up being homeless or having to choose between eating or, you know, paying the rent. Or maybe they'll have to go without electricity for the month. But really, the main thing that shows this is a conflict grift is how they behave during it. Conflict grifters will always effectively pretend to be peaceful and claim to be peaceful, and they'll even look like they're being peaceful. But that does not mean that they are not the ones who are causing the conflict. And they're just, again, taking advantage of the fact that a casual onlooker who doesn't know the context of the situation might not notice that. And that's why you see these traffic obstructors during their protests. They're, of course, sitting in the middle of traffic, trying to appear like some kind of Buddha, just peacefully sitting there while having others record the event. And they're doing it to make it seem like when someone finally gets pissed off with them enough, when someone gets out of their car and drags them away, they of course act like they're just innocently and peacefully sitting there and they're just being violently dragged away by some thug, which is of course not really what's happening. So that's why it's kind of important to look at edge case scenarios like this, because it's those edge case scenarios that conflict grifters love to stick their little weaselly claws in and take advantage of. And so it's important, even just from a basic philosophical standpoint, if you agree with the nap, you have to really understand what the nap is. A person can absolutely be sitting there doing absolutely nothing and appearing to be a Buddha, and yet they can technically be the ones who are causing the conflict. I've kind of pointed this out before in other videos I've made in regards to this topic of kind of faking victimhood, such as grievance grifters, or the grift of evading criticism by equating it to harassment. The reason why cowards are so hellbent on painting themselves as the victim is because that is a way that they can be aggressive and get away with it and avoid any kind of responsibility or pushback for it. In much the same way that equating criticism to harassment, for example, is just a way to evade criticism, the basics of the conflict grift is to evade punishment for causing the conflict. Instead, they reflect that punishment onto their victim, thus re-victimizing them again within the arena of justice. And it's very important for people who believe in things like natural law theory to be aware of this, because it's not always cut and dry. Conflict grifters will try to find those little edge cases for them to slip into, where they can cause conflicts that are beneficial to them while appearing like they're doing nothing wrong. And in a way, it's actually kind of simple when you think about it like that. You just have to remember that, oh yeah, evidence matters, context matters. But it's also so much more than that. Because I believe pretty much everybody watching this video, if they really look back on things, if you take a step back and just kind of look at everything that's happened to you throughout your life, I bet most of you can probably recall a time and place where you actually dealt with a conflict grifter just in day-to-day interaction. It's actually a really common thing to encounter in day-to-day life when you think about it. And the reason all just kind of comes down to incentives. Someone who's an aggressor that's trying to make themselves look good while screwing somebody else over, unless they're just a complete idiot, the obvious incentive is to try and come up with a strategy in order to do that without appearing to be the aggressor. That's really just political strategy 101, and that's really what this all comes down to. Make yourself always look like the good guy. That's essentially what the conflict grifter is really doing. Agitate the victim, provoke a response, and then when they do respond, you paint them as Voldemort and paint yourself as Harry Potter. And the clueless soy boys who have no understanding of the context will eat that crap right up. And it's kind of sad, really, because honestly, when you think about it, you'll realize that pretty much all politicians kind of do this. They're always trying to paint themselves as the hero, which makes it even weirder that we don't really have a good term to describe this kind of behavior and kind of tactics. And so I'll be trying to use this term conflict grifter a bit more in the future. I think it describes this kind of behavior a lot more directly and to the point than the current terms we have out there, such as cry bully and mid-level violence, etc. None of those terms really touch on what's really going on, which is an attempt to pervert the sense of the nap. It's an attempt to take advantage of how people view aggression and trick people into thinking that their victim is the aggressor. That is what the conflict grifter aims to do. It's a very simple, straightforward strategy, but it's one that we are constantly seeing pretty much every day. And it's sad to see so many people fall for Alex Padilla's nonsense when it was just such an obvious example of this buffoonery. And that's pretty much all I have to say on this topic. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to support my content, you can do so on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or becoming a member of the channel, or by buying some merch. Or again, you can check out this video's sponsor, Ground News. But that is all. Thanks again for watching. Till next time.